Hello learners, welcome to the course that is for MS 21. It is on social process and behavioral issues. We are going to discuss about a chapter called organizational culture, and in this chapter we'll be trying to focusing on exploring the three levels of culture and evaluating the roles they play in an organization. We'll also be discussing about some of the functions. Primarily, there are some four functions of culture that influences an organization. The concept of organizational culture, when we speak, it has a kind of its origin. And this has started from a subject called cultural anthropology. Just as we see that there are cultures in human society, there are also cultures within an organization. When we live in a society, normally all of us may find that the culture are actually being shared, communicated. And this sharing and communication takes place through different means, that is through symbols. And normally this gets to be passed on from one generation to the other. This is what in society we used to see. The concept of culture in the organization actually is alluded to as early as some of the studies that you can find out in behavioral science, and one of the studies is called Hawthorne study. And this Hawthorne study impressed on the fact about a culture which is called as a work group culture. Therefore, when the Hawthorne study happened long time back, by now it is close to 100 years, but the topic of organizational culture has came into the origin or came into the wake on its own during 1970s. Basically, when managers and researchers they started searching for something called as a very key word which can be a part of survival for an organization. In early 1980s, if I may be recalling, there are several books that has been written on organizational culture. For example, there is a book, that's a classic book which was written by Deal and Kennedy. They speak about corporate culture. There was another theorem that come into play that's called as an Auchi's theory Z. There is another beautiful book that was written on organizational culture that talks about the topic called In Search of Excellence by Peter and Waterman. So with these kind of books, actually the research began, and finally this elusive topic of organizational culture has came into play. So as I stated in the very beginning that in this session, we will be focusing in terms of understanding the levels of organizational culture. If we visit the definition of organizational culture, we may see many definitions which has come forward. They have agreed that there are various layers or levels are there in this organizational culture. And these levels and layers actually they are in terms of the visibility and their ability to be changed. So specifically when we think about something called as a definition of organizational, which you can call it is a corporate culture, that means it is a pattern of basic assumptions that are considered to be valid, and these the assumptions gets to be taught to the new members as the way to perceive, to think, and to feel. There is another behavioral scientist whose name is Edgar Schein, who has written a very comprehensive book on organizational culture and leadership. He suggested that organizational culture used to have three levels. Okay, the levels that he explained, this has been ranged from something called as a visible artifact and creations to testable values to something called as a very invisible and even pre-conscious basic assumptions. So to achieve a complete understanding of an organization culture, the levels that I spoke about over here that need to be studied. So one of the area is called as an artifact. Actually, cultural symbols, basically in the physical and social work environment that you see, are to be called as an artifact. Okay, they are mostly visible. They are the accessible level of culture. If you'd like to understand the culture through artifacts, okay, this actually lies in something called as figuring out their meaning, because artifacts are most frequently studied manifestation of organization culture because of their accessibility. And among the artifacts of culture, there are like personal enactment. You may use the word like ceremonies and rites, stories, rituals, and symbols. So these are to be called as an artifact. If I can recall a company like Google, the corporate culture of Google is apparent if you visit the headquarters of the Google. Okay, the headquarters of the Google is located at California. The lobby of the lobby of the Google company, the main office itself, actually you'll find out a lot of lava lamps, pianos, something as a live search on the Google search engine from around the world. The hallway itself, you can find there are bikes, exercise machines. The offices, if you'll see, they are laid back, featuring couches. They are occupied by dogs that go with their owners to work. So here, what it depicts, the artifacts at Google actually is reinforcing the notion that Google company is caring about its employees. They want them to be creative, want to make it comfortable. They want to make the people comfortable. Second is called as a personal enactment. Basically, culture can be understood in part when we examine the behavior of its organizational members. Personal enactment, what I'm referring to over here, learners, it is a behavior that is reflecting the values of an organization. In particular, personal enactment by the senior members of a company. They actually provide an insight to the values. For example, if you see our own Indian company, Infosys. Infosys has its founding father, who is N.R. Murthy, N.R. Narayan Murthy. He says that the softest pillow is something called as a clear conscience, which reflects the corporate culture at Infosys. Narayan Murthy reflects the corporate culture at Infosys, actually. He found one of the rule that the retirement age at Infosys will be 60, the age of 60 for all. And what he did, when he attained the age of 60, he himself actually followed that rule. He vacated his office in the corporate headquarters, and he then moved on to another secondary building in the campus itself as a co-founder. Okay. There is another man in Infosys whose name is Nandan Nilekani. Okay. So both Narayan Murthy and Nandan Nilekani used to get their salaries. Okay. And it is very strange for globally based $1 million companies of the company, if I may referring to around in 2015, they were getting $75,000 each. Okay, and by any means, it is a very stark comparison with the top management of any, if you refer to any American or European company. Okay, so therefore, whatever the retirement age that he has fixed up and all that, this is actually is a sign of, the top management's egalitarian philosophy. So therefore, friends, modeled behavior actually is a very powerful learning tool for its employees. So over here, individuals normally, what they do, they learn vicariously. How they learn? They learn by observing others, by patterning their own behavior according to the need. So culture can be an important leadership tool. Managerial behavior, that is, can be clarified on terms of understanding what is important, and it coordinate with the employees, right? So this is the personal enactment, which is a part of artifacts. Similarly, if you'll see the ceremonies and rites, ceremonies and rites, they talk about something called as a very elaborate set of activities that are repeatedly being enacted. The ceremonies normally bond the organizational members together. If you'll see the Taj group, okay, Taj group of hotel. What they believe, they believe that their employees are the greatest asset. And that is what the very survival of that business. If you may recall, in 2001, the Taj Group has launched, a program called as an employee loyalty program. That's called as a program called, STARS. The full form of STARS is Special Thanks and Recognition System. This is aimed, this is initiated and aimed to motivate the employee to transcend their usual duties and responsibilities and to have fun, doing their work. So over here, ceremonies and rites, basically a kind of it that, a company like Taj does creates. There is another thing that's called as the stories, because if you see some of the research, they have argued that one of the most effective way to reinforce the organizational value is through stories, because they are retold, because stories give something called as a meaning and identity to organization, and they are very helpful in orienting the new employees. Okay, there are companies like Walmart. You can, if you visit the Walmart of China, okay, you will actually read the true story of Jeff. Jeff, who is a pharmacist in Harrison, a small town in the deep in the Ozarks. So when Jeff received a early morning weekend call telling him that a diabetic patient need insulin, he quickly opened his pharmacy and filled the prescription. So, while Arkansas and Beijing are world apart, stories of such nature, actually they help transform the company like Walmart's corporate personality to its new Asian associates. So, therefore, stories actually about the boss, for example, about stories about something called as how the company is dealing the employees when they are looking for a relocation, stories about whether lower level employees can rise to the top, stories about how the company is dealing with the crisis situations. Okay, so these are some of the themes that can emerge when stories are passed down. And to be effective cultural tool, when we are creating stories, stories must be credible. Okay, so effective stories we need to build up with that. The next one is called as a ritual. Ritual mean every day what an organization actually practices. Okay, these rituals, when you refer to, they are the unwritten, but they used to send a very clear-cut message that the way we do things around over here is something we do it, and whoever wants to be a part of it, they need to follow. So, as everyday practices, rituals basically reinforce the organizational culture. Okay, insiders who are actually commonly practicing the rituals may be unaware of their subtle influences, but outsiders recognize it. So this is about the rituals, friends. The next one is called as symbols. Symbols basically communicate the organizational culture through unspoken messages. Southwest Airlines, what it does is it uses symbols in various ways. During its initial years, the airline actually emphasizes about, say, customer service value. How? By using the heart symbol, the love of the airline, and the love bites, I think, the peanuts, right? So this is about the symbols. So this is all about the artifacts we discussed about it. The next one is called the values. Values are something which is very second and a very deeper level of culture. Values actually reflect a person's inherent belief on what should or what should not be. Values are normally, they are consciously we articulate both in conversation and in a company's mission statement, or values we can see it in an annual report. So something, there may be a difference between a company's something called as an espoused values. Espoused values mean, friends, what the members say, the organization members say they value, and it's enacted values. Enacted values means, the values that is reflected in the way actually the members behave. So values may be reflected in the behavior of individual, which is actually is an artifact of a culture. One of the research study which has investigated the gender gap in a sports organization that's in Canada itself, they found that the coach and athletes had come to believe that the inequality between the espoused and enacted values was normal or natural, right? In Indian context, if you'll see the popular cultural framework that was extended by a HR theorist whose name is Uday Parikh, who called it as an octopus. Okay, octopus, OCTAPACE. Okay, because octopus itself, the culture that relies on ethos, which is actually is an underlying spirit or characteristics of a group, and is made up of its belief, customs, or practice. Okay, octopus, OCTAPAC. O mean openness, that's a value itself. The spontaneous expression of feelings and thoughts. Confrontation, OC, C is confrontation. Confrontation means it is like, facing rather than shying away from the problem. Trust, that means that maintaining the confidentiality of information. Authenticity means creating a congruence between what we feel, what we say, what we do. Proactions mean taking the initiatives, plan it beforehand. Autonomy, the way we give the freedom, to give the feedback and kind of things. Collaboration, how we collaborate to help others. Okay, experimentation, that means the octopus, the last T, the means using, encouraging innovative approach to solve the problems, right? So these are all the values. The last one is called as an assumptions. Assumptions, basically, they are the deeply held belief that is guiding the behavior, and it tells the members how to perceive a specific situation and the people. At the very deepest, at the very fundamental level of an organizational culture is the assumptions. And Edgar Skene, what I was mentioning to you earlier, friends, they are to be called as the essence of a culture. Assumptions, actually, they are so strongly held that a member of an organization, they behave in a fashion that would violate them is unthinkable. Another characteristics of assumption is that they are sometimes often unconscious. Organizational member, sometimes, they may not be aware of their assumptions, and sometimes they get to be very, very reluctant, to discuss them, or they think about changing them, right? So, in the assumptions itself, we can see, while in unconscious assumptions, they are sometimes, they guide a firm's actions and decisions. Because some companies, they're quite explicit about their assumptions about their employees itself, right? So this is what the assumptions are, because which is called as a very deeply held belief. Therefore, friends, if you see the diagram itself, you can find out the levels of organizational culture, what we discussed till now, artifacts, which is actually been visible, but you cannot decipher it. Okay, artifacts, therefore, is a summation of something like enactment, the maintenance of the ceremonies and rites, following the, having a set of stories behind it, following certain rituals and symbols, right? The next one is called as the values, which we discussed. Values talks about something called as a greater level of awareness, testable in the physical environment, testable only by the social consciousness. And something called as very taken for granted and invisible pre-consciousness talks about the relationship that we build up with an environment. the nature of reality, nature of time, nature of space, nature of human nature, nature of human activity, nature of human relations. So these are to be called as the basic assumptions. And as I told, the basic assumptions actually, they have a very deeply held belief that guides the behavior and tell the members of an organization how to perceive a situation. Okay. Next comes the functions of an organization culture. And in these functions of an organization culture, we may see in an organization, basically the culture serves as four basic functions. The first function is culture provides a kind of identity to its members. Okay, when we affiliate ourselves to an organization, we get identified with it. We start building our enhancement towards the commitment, the organizational requirements. Therefore, the people who are working in an organization, when they internalize the values of the company, you know, they find the work intrinsically rewarding them. Okay, they start identifying themselves with their fellow workers. So we may find that motivation gets enhanced and employees gets more committed. Therefore, that is one of the primary functions of organizational culture. The second one, the culture basically that provides a way for employees to interpret the meaning of the organizational events. Over here, leaders, what they do, they use the symbols like the corporate logo, okay, to help the employees to understand the changing nature of their organization. Okay, sometimes symbols, what it happens is they can remain the same to ensure that that sometimes stay constant despite the changing conditions itself. Okay, other times you may see the symbols need to change to reflect the new culture that is set up in an organization. Third, the culture actually reinforces the values of an organization. Whatever the values that we follow, that actually culture reinforces it. Finally, the fourth one, culture, that basically serves as a control mechanism. Okay, it serves as a control mechanism for shaping the behavior of its people. Norms that is guiding the behavior are actually the part of the culture. See, if the norm of the company actually is focusing on promoting the teamwork, then the culture is supposed to reinforce that norm. Okay, if you visit a Japanese organization, you will find that they promote a teamwork. Their country, their corporates, the companies, they work in a team culture. So the company's culture must be characterized. It is expected that they need to be characterized by open communication. Okay, and similarly, they need to build up a cooperation between the team members. There should be a good amount of integration of teams. So therefore, culture can also be used as a powerful tool to discourage the dysfunctional and the deviant behavior in organizations. And whenever we set the norms that can send a very clear message that certain behaviors or certain things actually are not being acceptable. So therefore, friends, in this session itself, our focus was more in terms of understanding the three levels of culture. And also, we have deeply understood in terms of evaluating the roles, each of the facets of the culture, how they play in an organization. The second impression that we have built up in this discussion is in terms of evaluating the four different functions of a culture within an organization. As I said, culture creates an identity, culture provides a kind of meaning, culture reinforces the values that is being set up, and culture also been acting as a control mechanism for shaping the employee's behavior. So this is all about setting you first with the foundational lay stone in terms of understanding the importance and the functions of organizational culture, friends. Thank you so much.